Well, it is so good to be with you this morning. Welcome to Community of Hope. If I have not met you yet, I am not a guest here, actually. I was gone the last couple of weekends. It is good to be back with you all. And my name's Jeremy Wike, and I was camping with my family a week ago. And this is our sixth summer in a row where we have gone up to 12 Mile Beach along the Lake Superior shore of Lake Michigan. And in order to get there, you have to cross the Mackinac Bridge. And some of you have been across the Mackinac Bridge. It's 5 miles long. It's actually quite impressive. And as you drive north crossing it, you have Lake Huron to the east, you have Lake Michigan to the west, and you're driving north-south, and it connects the Lower Peninsula and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. They're two very different places, I've learned, the Upper and the Lower Peninsula. Both of them are part of Michigan, of course, but the UP, in fact, they call themselves Yoopers up there. It is more rustic. It is definitely less developed. It's more primitive. Cell service is much more patchy. There's no chain restaurants, and you definitely plan your gas stops between as you're driving. But as the dog days of summer have hit us hard here, while I was there at night, it was the upper 40s, early low 50s in temperature. Very different place. But also in the UP, they speak English. They look very much like us. They're extremely friendly. In fact, you could drive across the bridge and you could fall asleep in the back seat, drive across the bridge, wake up, and all of a sudden, you may not even know you're in a very different place. Sometimes border crossings are not very drastic at all. Sometimes they rock your world, but when we cross borders, there's always an invitation to see something you hadn't seen before. Today, as we open up the scriptures, we're going to see a border crossing by Jesus that I think should cause everyone who calls themselves a Christ follower to pause. And everyone who is a skeptic or has ever felt judged by a Christian or by the Bible, it should cause you great delight. This morning, as we open up the Gospel of Mark, where we've been there all summer long, and if you've been with us, you know that we've been describing discipleship in the Gospels. And as we head into the fall, I've hinted at it, and we're shifting our focus heading into the fall as a church to focus on being more intentional change agents in our world, wherever we live, work, and play. In spite of all the things in the world we cannot change, we are called by Jesus to be change agents in our world. So if you have a handout there on your seat in front of you, your first fill-in, you should know it by now. We've said this over and over again, that a disciple is someone who makes the most important thing in life to be like Jesus. That's what discipleship is. And we've been in a series called Trial and Error. And yes, if you were the last couple of weeks, we took a hiatus in the Olivet Discourse in Mark 13 with my friend Aaron Peer, and yet today we're back in the Trial and Error series, and we're seeing in the Gospel of Mark stories of discipleship failures. We're going to get to those in the next few weeks, but also unlikely successes. Today is an unlikely success, and it should cause us to all reflect. The Gospel of Mark this morning, as we're going to see in the text of Scripture, brilliantly illustrates by a story what the Bible goes to great pains to communicate from beginning to end. Now, there's some bad news. It may cause some of us to have to do some soul searching. The good news is that Jesus never gives up on us. But we want to ask ourselves before we open up the Scriptures, two basic questions that are pretty important in life. Two questions that many Christians may not have ever really considered specifically for a host of reasons. The first question I want to pose to you this morning is this: why did Jesus come to earth? Think about that. Many of us, we want to blurt out a quick answer, and some of the answers we would blurt out maybe partially true, but why did Jesus come to earth? Now, because the Gospels in the Scriptures tell us who Jesus is, it would be natural that we would go to the Scriptures to learn the answer, because anything apart from what the Scriptures say is just an opinion, And we don't care about people's opinions. We want to know, what does God say? Why did Jesus come to earth? And the best place to answer the question is out of the mouth of Jesus himself. Luke chapter 19, verse 10, in his discussion with that wee little man, as the Sunday school song says, called Zacchaeus, we learn Jesus tells us himself why he came. He said, "For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." Now, Son of Man there is a title that Jesus is designating for himself. If you want to look it up, it's from Daniel chapter 7, verse 13. He's borrowing that language and referring to himself. But you have to ask the question, what is lost? A more appropriate question is, who is lost? For those of us who are Christians, the famous hymn, Amazing Grace, answers the question, doesn't it? For I once was lost, but now I'm found. Amen? That is the answer. I once was lost. But here is where, when we get to the second question that I want to pose this morning, here's where we get a lot of static this morning, and it's done great harm for the church and many Christians. You know, static when you're trying to talk to somebody and you can't quite hear. It's caused a lot of static. We don't quite have clarity on the second questions. We don't know what to do now that we have been found. There's a lot of static in the church world and in our culture. What do we do now that we've been found? Is it we fill in the answer, well, we just wait to go to heaven. Well, you know what? We should probably just go to church on Sunday mornings. Well, you know what? We should probably just follow the rules. We should probably get really angry at sin in our world. We should probably keep ourselves from being contaminated from all the evil and all the evil people. We answer the question, and some of that is true. That is not the answer to the question, what we do now. And there's a lot of static. And I would pose, you all know experientially, that when non-Christians, those who are not yet followers of Jesus, do not have clarity because they're static in our minds, we don't know what we're supposed to do now, it doesn't make them want to come join us on this journey of following Jesus. Now, I'm certainly not trying to bang on Christians creating guilt. I would like to create clarity, and I think the scriptures do here this morning. The static has caused a whole lot of questions and a whole lot of problems for Christians because we don't know how to answer this second question. If the first question is, why did Jesus come to earth? To seek and to save the lost. The second question then is, why does Jesus leave you on earth? Well, if a disciple is someone who makes the most important thing in life to be like Jesus, and Jesus came to seek and to save the lost, then why does Jesus leave you on earth? If you were once lost, but now you're found. The Gospel of Mark does answer this question by illustrating what was scandalous to the religious people of Jesus' day. Because Jesus invites all people to cross a border from where they are to where he is, as we're going to see here this morning. Mark shows us that the religious people in Jesus' day didn't want to cross the border from where they were to where Jesus is, and that should terrify us who are all too versed in churchianity in America today. With that said, I invite you to open your Bibles to Mark chapter 7, beginning verse 24. And I want to introduce to you, if you read the whole Gospel of Mark, and you'll have the opportunity this week to read the whole thing, you're going to see that this encounter that Jesus has with an unlikely person is the first person in the Gospel of Mark. Clear into chapter 7, she's the first person to understand the mission of Jesus. In the first 6 chapters of Mark, Jesus is ministering in Jewish territory among his own people. He's among his people. He's teaching, he's healing, he's challenging the religious elites. He's got his 12 closest disciples following along with him. They're the ones that had the most access to him. You're going to see next week that they were completely lost as to why Jesus had come on his mission up to this point. No one could answer the question, why did Jesus come to earth? They would probably say, if I could put words into their mouth, why, if you'd ask the Jewish people who had access to Jesus, why did he come to earth? Well, listen, he came to help me. He came to heal me. He came to protect us, his people. He came to make me happy. He came to take me to heaven. That might be how they answered the question. None of them would have said, he came to seek and to save their enemies. Mark shows us Jesus will leave the comfort of his own people, and he will go to those people. So we read Mark 7, verse 24. Here's what we read. Jesus left that place, which would have been Galilee, and went to the vicinity of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know it, yet he could not keep his presence secret. You have to know that there's a little bit of background here. If you look on the map there in front of you, there up on the screen, you look on that map, you'll see the red dot there towards the bottom center there. That's Jerusalem. You look in the green part, that's all Jewish territory there in Israel in the first century world. You look up there at the top, you see red dots, Tyre and Sidon, and you see the orange there, it's Phoenicia. That's the region where Jesus goes to. That's enemy territory. It would be when Jesus leaves his hometown, goes to Tyre, it would have been like Jesus saying this, guys, next week we're going to worship in Kensington, Pennsylvania, in the outskirts of Philadelphia. We are going to the very place where there is open air drug use going on all around you, where people might have the appearance of being like zombies. There is low employment. There is all sorts of poverty. There's all sorts of crime. Some of you have been there. Our high school students were just there a couple of weeks ago in Philadelphia. I've been there a couple of times myself. One of the most crime-ridden, drug-infested areas in the country. Guys, we're going to have our worship service there next week. Hope to see you there. That's like what Jesus did. That's how extreme it would have been when Jesus went to Tyre in his public ministry. Now, we go on. There's more to it than that. Why was it so hostile there? Well, Tyre was the home of Jezebel. Some of you remember in 1 Kings chapter 16 in the Old Testament, you remember during the days of the prophet Elijah, King Ahab was king, and the writer in 1 Kings chapter 16 says this, King Ahab, quote, did more evil in the sight of the Lord than any king before him. Not a good dude. He married Queen Jezebel. She was from the region of Tyre and Sidon up in Phoenicia. That's her hometown. But it gets worse than that. The Jewish people of the first century world would not only have had a little PTSD thinking about that place, but during the Maccabean revolt, think 2nd century BC, think Hanukkah. During the Maccabean revolt, Tyre and Sidon, that region of Phoenicia, fought against the Jews. It gets worse. Josephus, a couple decades after Jesus there in the first century world, said of Tyre, he said the inhabitants of Tyre were notoriously our bitterest enemies. The last place you want to go is there, and that's the very place that Jesus goes. What was Jesus doing in Tyre? He was there to seek and to save the lost. That's why he was there. You want to know what the typical church person's response is to the need of people out there? Jesus goes to Tyre, he goes to that place, and the typical church person says, you know what, we should have another potluck. He goes there. Let's be honest. Many of us don't care because we're very comfortable here. What happens next is one of the most unique stories in all the Gospels. For the Bible-believing Christian, it should cause us to scratch our heads. But for those who might be skeptical or a person who's not really sure what you think about Jesus, it should also cause you to scratch their heads. Mark gives us details which are intended to provoke us. They're intended to irritate us. They're intended to challenge us and to draw lost, broken, wounded people to Jesus, because Jesus came to seek and to save the lost. So we read in verses 25 and 26 of Mark 7, in fact, as soon as she heard about him, a woman whose little daughter was possessed by an impure spirit came and fell at his feet. The woman was a Greek, born in Syrian Phoenicia. She begged Jesus to drive the demon out of her daughter. Jesus crossed a border to where those who are far away from God lived. This mother herself would have crossed a border to get to Jesus. As one commentator, his name's James Edwards, said this. He says, verse 26, what we just read, reads like a crescendo of demerit, he says. She is a woman in that world, that's a strike against you. She's a Greek Gentile, strike against you. From the infamous pagans of Syrian Phoenicia, think Jezebel, strike 3 against her. And yet, here she is at the feet of Jesus, begging him to heal her daughter. She was desperate. And she wanted to know, would this guy heal her daughter? The woman would never, in her wildest dreams, cross into Jewish territory and go to Jesus. She would have never done that. Jesus crossed the border and goes to her. And what happened when Jesus crossed that border? There she is at his feet. The conversation that follows can be confusing if you don't have any context. Here's what we read in verses 27 through 28. She's at his feet. She wants her daughter healed. She asks Jesus, would you heal my daughter? We read this. First, let the children eat all they want, Jesus told her, for it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. Lord, she replied, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. Again, you first encounter that and you're like, that makes no sense. Well, remind ourselves there was great risk in this woman coming to Jesus asking for healing for her daughter. So if you're reading this and you're a Jewish person, no doubt you perk up and you're listening. If you're a Gentile person who's used to being judged by the Jews and you read this, your ears perk up too. What is going on here? Jesus is talking about children eating bread and tossing the bread to the dogs. But make note of this, the woman clearly understands what he's talking about, doesn't she? In this encounter. Is Jesus calling this woman a dog? Is he telling her to go away because the bread is only for the Jews? This woman boldly responds to the metaphor of Jesus. This encounter is unlike any other encounter in the Gospels. If you're Jesus, you know you have two audiences who are waiting for your response. If you are Jewish, what do you want Jesus to tell this woman? If you're a Gentile far away from the Jewish people, you're used to being judged by them. What do you want Jesus to tell her? Well, children, that reference there is a metaphor. In the Old Testament, children clearly was a reference to Israel. We see that in many different places, including Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 1, where in the law, God says, you are the children of the Lord your God. There's other places in reference to that. Children is referring to ethnic Israel. The dogs in the Old Testament, virtually always a negative connotation, and it referred to Gentiles, outsiders. In the Old Testament, it was always bad. There were lots of places where there are references to dogs, always negative. In the New Testament, we have places like that too. The Apostle Paul, Philippians chapter 3, calls his enemies dogs, right? So let me ask the question again. Did Jesus call this woman a dog? It's very provocative. The truth is, the word that we get here in the Greek, which is then translated, which may be lost on you, is not the same word for a feral street dog, which was clearly frowned upon and used in a derogatory sense. The word that Jesus uses here, that Mark puts into his mouth and records, is the word that's a house dog. It's very different connotation. And the key is that Jesus says in verse 27, first, let the children eat all they want. And if there's a first, There's also a second, isn't there? And what we see is that the woman grasps what Jesus is saying. She is the first in the Gospel of Mark to understand a parable that Jesus tells her. Jesus is saying these house dogs, the Gentiles, are a part of the household of God. They're going to be a part of the family. That's what Jesus is saying to her. And they will be fed just like the children. That's what he's saying to her. And she knew it. Well, what did Jesus mean by this talk of children, dogs, and bread? And what did the woman mean about dogs eating breadcrumbs under the table? The Gospel of Mark is giving us a beautiful snapshot of the mission of Jesus, answering the question, why did he come? Jesus, in essence, is saying, why, yes, I have come to save the Jews, as God promised in the Old Testament. But I came to not only save the Jews, I've come to save the Gentiles too. This Gentile who crossed borders to come to Jesus understood what the other disciples of Jesus had missed. Jesus came to seek and to save the lost. This woman's response to Jesus was courageous and very clear. She is acknowledging to Jesus, I know I am not worthy. I know I'm an outsider. I am so desperate, sir. Is there any grace in you left for me? That's what she's asking him. Could there be anything left for me? She understands that his mission is to help the Jews. She asks, could you help me too? And as we see all over the place in the Gospels, Jesus is full of surprises. If you're a doubter or a skeptic, you feel like you've been an outsider, you've been pushed aside perhaps by Christians or people claiming the name of Jesus, this story should inspire you. Those people who push you aside are wrong. That's not the Jesus of the New Testament. The Jesus of the New Testament takes outsiders and he says, come cross the border, come to me because I've crossed the border to come to you. Jesus crosses borders. She comes to him. Here's his response from the metaphor in verses 29 through 30. Then Jesus told her, for such a reply, you may go. The demon has left your daughter. She went home and found her child lying on the bed and the demon gone. Whoa. Who has that kind of audacity? And who gets that kind of response from Jesus? Listen, you got to go back into chapter 6 where Mark is clearly giving us a clue here. Chapter 6, verses 5 and 6, Mark has already told us Jesus goes back to his hometown of Nazareth. And here's what Mark tells us. It is the hometown boy. This is what we read. Jesus could not do any miracles there except lay his hands on a few sick people and heal them. He was amazed at their lack of faith. To this woman, he says, you may go, the demon has left your child. Jesus crosses the border and he goes to Kensington. Why? The Son of Man came to seek and to save that which was lost. His disciples, again, we're going to see this next week, they don't understand. Next week, we'll see as we get into chapter 8. They don't understand what Jesus is doing. What do you mean, Jesus? Well, I think we should unpack now that in this story, it follows in your handout there. Mark includes this particular story to tell outsiders 3 important truths the church people often fail to grasp. That's so hard for us. We are often like the followers of Jesus who don't get it. Mark tells us this story to communicate 3 things to us. First, Jesus crosses boundaries that even Christians may not. We may not be willing to go, but he did. Today, perhaps not you, But there are many Christians who pride themselves in shaming outsiders and intentionally staying away from people who have not yet come to faith in Jesus. We take pride in believing we're right, and therefore they must be wrong. And of course, I certainly don't want to imply that we don't have to have wisdom in the spaces in which we go, especially evil spaces. Of course, we need to exercise wisdom, and of course, we are to never participate in evil, of course. But that's not the same as staying away from unbelievers who need Jesus, because Jesus crossed the border and goes to them. So how will people far away from God come to him if we won't go to them? Of course, we must be prayerful. Of course, we must learn to listen to the voice of God, which gives us wisdom and discernment. Of course, we must be willing to cross borders that sometimes can feel very intimidating. Sometimes we go and we're like, oh God, am I sinning when I go into these spaces? Of course, that's natural. That is normal, of course. But I can think of 3 reasons at least why some Christians think that it is not their responsibility to cross borders to help people far from God so that they can come close to him. And I don't know you and your story. I just know some that I've encountered, probably some in my own life. And the first is this: some of us just have bad theology. And I don't know how else to say that. We have bad theology. We read the Bible and we think, ooh, stay away from. You look at Jesus and he runs too. Those very people. Nowhere in the Bible does it tell us to avoid contact with unbelievers. It says stay away from evil. It doesn't say stay away from evil people who are far away from God. The second reason is fear. All of us have these fears. If I go and I try to do something to cross a border and to help people, we feel that perhaps some of us struggle with sin and we don't want to participate in sin. And that's valid. It's a valid fear. Some of us, we fear failure. We fear being judged. We fear being laughed at. We fear that this might be really hard. And let's be honest, church potlucks are easy and comfortable. We know this. We know how to act in this space. But going out there is much harder. I remember my wife and I, when we were first married, we had a couple that we were trying to reach for Christ. They didn't know Jesus, and we were being very intentional with them. And I remember the awkward conversation. My wife and I are engaged to be married. We start talking about going on a getaway, a weekend getaway with them. And we wanted to go to a place with them. And I remember how they were just absolutely, it was beyond their comprehension that my wife and I said, before we are married, we will not go on a trip with you and share a bedroom with you. After we are married, we will gladly go and we will share a bedroom. And it blew their mind that we chose sexual purity before we were married. They couldn't comprehend it. They certainly didn't reject us and walk away from us. But I remember it was hard. That was a very hard, awkward conversation for us to have. The third thing, why some of us think, it's not my responsibility, is just ignorance. We feel ignorant. I don't have enough Bible knowledge. I've never practiced. I don't have a mentor. I don't have anybody to show me how to do it. This is really hard. What if somebody asks me a doozy question I don't know the answer to? Just this week, I had somebody ask me in a conversation with somebody I just met. Somebody says, how can you prove the virgin birth? That sounds scientifically ridiculous, doesn't it? I gave an answer. I gave an altar call. No one came. That was a hard question. Of course, people are going to ask us questions that we may not know how to answer or what to do. But here's what we do know. Jesus came to give life and hope and healing and forgiveness and freedom to all people. Well, the second reason that Mark includes this story, talking to outsiders in a way that church people often fail to grasp, is this: that Jesus responds to human desperation. he doesn't force himself on people who don't think they need him. So allow me to venture into a bit of psychology for Christ followers this morning. Those of us who claim the name of Jesus, it's easy for us to sometimes assume that people don't want to follow or learn more about Jesus because they love their sin and because they tell us they don't want Jesus for any myriad of reasons, and so we leave them alone. Let me ask you a couple of questions here this morning. They're honest questions that I have. Thinking about they don't want anything about Jesus. They love their sin. They don't want to follow him. They've even said as much. Let me ask you this. Have you ever met a Christ follower who did not at one time love their sin? Have you met Christ followers today who still struggle with loving sin? And the answer, I do. Crossing borders means meeting people where they're at. So if you're a doubter or a skeptic this morning, you felt rejected, perhaps judged by Christians, I don't know your story, but Jesus is waiting for you. He crosses the border coming to you this morning. Jesus, as we encounter in the Gospels, he doesn't mingle with the bitter, self-righteous, proud folk. Jesus engages the broken, the desperate, those who know they lack something. As Jesus said in Matthew 11, 28 through 30, Jesus said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light." He says that to all of us. The third reason Mark includes this story, telling outsiders some things that church people often fail to grasp. Jesus can change the heart of the most unlikely people. I've seen it with my own eyes. Some of you have too. People who are alcoholics, who come to faith in Jesus, who are freed from their alcoholic addiction and fall in love with Jesus. I've had people who have told me they hate preachers because they were abused by preachers in their past. God gets a hold of their heart and they come follow him. People who have told me horrendous stories of abuse in their past, some in their present, and they come to faith in Jesus. There are people who are so successful in life, they have everything they could possibly want, and yet they still feel empty. People come to faith in Jesus. There are people who are struggling with identity questions, and God gets a hold of their heart. People who they're just really good people, and they don't really need God. And at some point, they realize, and they ask themselves this question: is that it? Is that all there is? There are people who never grew up knowing much about God, never thought much about him. And life hit them. And they begin asking different questions about the meaning of life, why they're here. And is Jesus real? I've seen every one of those with my own eyes. Jesus can change the heart of the most unlikely people. They all have one thing in common. Jesus crossed the border into their life, and they then chose to receive his love and grace and mercy and forgiveness. And I'll bet every one of those people, those unlikely people, those people that you in your own mind might even say never, the people I know of, I know who they were and I know who they are, I'll bet every single one of them would say that there was at least one Christ follower who crossed the boundary and went into their life and showed them the love of Jesus. And I am here to tell you, Community of Hope, Jesus is not done changing lives yet. He is still changing lives, and he is going to use you, if you will let him use you. The plan of God has always been to bring life and healing to the broken. The story of the scriptures tells in Genesis 1 and 2 of a perfect world that God created with a perfect relationship with Adam and Eve. Genesis 3 tells of their rebellion against God, sending the world into a tailspin. Genesis 4 through 11 then tells us and illustrates the chaotic world in which we live. A brother kills his brother out of jealousy. Cain kills Abel. The world is so chaotic and evil that God raises up one man and his family to build a large boat while everyone laughed and mocked him, and God had to destroy the world with a flood because the world was so evil, and he started over. And then after all of that, the story goes in this tailspin. The description is that people decided we'll get together and we'll build a tower to God and we'll be like God. And then we have God scattering them all into people groups, the Tower of Babel. That's the description of the tailspin of the world after God has to judge the world because of rebellion. It's into that world. How does God respond to the world in a tailspin? The scriptures tell us in chapter 12, God calls one man, Abram, later renamed Abraham, and he tells him this in Genesis 12:3. This is the plan of God. This is how God responds to evil and chaos and brokenness in the world. He says, all peoples on earth will be blessed through you, Abraham. All peoples on earth. Later on, they become a nation. Of course, there's a lot of story and sequence in there. Israel is rebellious against God, even though he had set them apart and gave them a particular mission, and they're suffering, and God has to judge them, and they are exiled from their homeland. We read the prophet Isaiah, chapter 49, verse 6. God says this about a coming Messiah who would rescue his people. He says this, "It is too small a thing for you to be my servant, to restore the tribes of Jacob and bring back those of Israel I have kept." Too small, too small. What I'm about to do is bigger than you, Israel. Here we go. "I will also make you a light for the Gentiles, that my salvation may reach," where? To the ends of the earth. That's the plan of God. It always has been the plan of God. And Mark's story of this woman from Jezebel country reminds us that Jesus came to rescue Israel, and he came to rescue Gentiles. He came to rescue all of us. The people of God in this world today are not separated from the world by their political views. We're not separated from the world just by our high moral standards. We stink at high moral standards often in the church anyway. That's not what separates us from the world. It's not where we spend Sunday mornings. That's what makes us different from the world. It's not how many Bible verses we have on our living room walls. That's not what separates us from the world. What separates us from the world? Jesus said, John 13, verse 34 through 35, what should separate us who are Christ followers from the world? Jesus made it really painfully clear. "By this will all men know that you are my disciples, if you love one another." That's what separates us from the world. Our calling, church, Christ followers, is not to retreat from the world. Our calling is to engage, to cross boundaries, to partner with Jesus, to seek and to save the lost. That's our calling. The Apostle Paul, Romans chapter 1, verse 16 says these powerful, powerful words. Paul proclaims them. This is our proclamation as well. Paul says this. He says, "I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jews, then to the Gentiles." Does that make a little more sense? The gospel, the good news is that Jesus came to earth to rescue humanity. And he rescues us by dying on a cross for the forgiveness of sins, rising again 3 days later, conquering sin and death. And he's now calling a people to himself who, when we place our faith and trust in him, we are then forgiven our sins and made a part of his family. The power of God is that lives are changed supernaturally. You and I can't save anybody, but the power of God can. Salvation to everyone who believes. The offer of salvation is to all people. The offer of salvation is to you. The offer of salvation is to all those people that you think, nah, they're too far away from God. The offer of salvation is to us all. "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jews, then to the Gentiles. I've been telling you about it the last couple of weeks. We did it 10 years ago. We're going to do it again. We're in the Gospel of Mark this summer. It's the end of July. School's almost starting for those of you who are in that rhythm as a family. We're going to do our 33 days in the Gospel of Mark. Aaron Peer, who was here the last couple of weeks, he and I wrote this series, this study 10 years ago. 33 days, we're going to cover the entire book of Mark. It's devotionals that are broken up 33 days. They're intended to be done with your kids. They're intended to be done with spouses. They're intended to be done by yourself. They're intended for everybody to take advantage of them. As summer rolls along, some of you may be like, I'm out of my rhythm. And this is a great way to set good rhythms in your life to be spending time with God. For those of you, school is about to start. Let's get into good rhythms now before school starts as we head into school in the next couple of weeks. If you're a skeptic and you don't know what to think, this is a great way for you to read who is Jesus and why did he come? If you want, you can grab a hard copy of the whole thing down on our resource table. If we run out, we'll print more, I promise. If you want an electronic copy, you don't want to take one with you, you can download it on our website. There's a tab on the upper right-hand corner. Click on that tab. You can download each and every day individually and go through and study the Gospel of Mark. Why does Jesus leave you on earth? That's an important question. He wants to use you to cross borders, to help people far away from God find hope and healing in him. That's why he leaves you on earth.